Thank you.
I'm so sorry. I just came back from vacation.
Was that the match?
What's going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, Magnus Carlsen is facing off against the lovely Alexandra Botez in a private one-on-one blitz match, and the rules here are simple. Magnus Carlsen has 30 seconds on the clock versus the 5 minutes of Alexandra. But can Magnus Carlsen pull out a win despite the time deficit? Let's find out. Now in the game, Alexandra Botez is playing as white. She opens 1d3, very interesting idea, and Magnus Carlsen, he pre-moved the idea 1g6, the modern defense. Now g3 for Alexandra, she's playing the copycat variation. Then we have bishop g7, bishop g2, knight to f6, knight to f3, and short castles for Magnus. Now here in this position, the most logical idea would be short castles. However, here, Alexandra, she mixes things up and does gain space in the center with the move e4, and Magnus Carlsen did not expect this move. In fact, he had the move d5 pre-moved, meaning no matter what Alexandra did, he was playing the move d5 in this position. Remember, it is an online blitz game. Magnus only has 30 seconds on the clock versus the 5 minutes of Alexandra, and he has to move fast to stay in the game. All right, now here in this position, Alexandra, she thinks and she finds the best idea. e5, gaining space in the center. She has that strong pawn on e5, and she is knocking back that knight on f6. Now here, Magnus Carlsen, unfortunately for him, he pre-moved the idea c5, meaning no matter what Alexandra does, he was playing c5 on this move. And now here on move 7, Alexandra, she takes the knight of Magnus Carlsen, and yes, Magnus did blunder the knight. So e takes f6 on the board, but of course this is Magnus Carlsen we're talking about. He's not out of the game by any means. All right, now here, Magnus Carlsen, the most logical idea is bishop takes f6. Instead, he takes with the e-pawn. E takes f6 on the board, a very interesting idea. Magnus trying to imbalance the middle game here, giving him more attacking chances against the white king. All right, now Alexandra, short castles on the board, the best move, and Magnus goes knight to c6. Now here, the best move for Alexandra is going to be d4, breaking in the center and trying to get black that isolated pawn on d5 after either d takes c5 or c takes d4. However, instead of that here, she does go knight to c3, just developing the knight on the queen's side. Now Magnus Carlsen, he finds a very simple attacking idea. Bishop to e6, the idea being he wants to follow up with the move queen d7 and then bishop h3, trying to weaken the light squares all around the white king side after that bishop on g2 does fall. Now here, Alexandra, rook e1 on the board, a logical idea, and Magnus does go queen d7, continuing his idea. Now here, Alexandra, she starts to play a series of relatively passive moves. She starts bishop d2. Not a bad move per se, but a little bit passive. Instead, again, d4 was the right idea for Alexandra. Now Magnus, rook f to e8, not going bishop h3 yet. Now Alexandra, again, a passive move, a3, guarding that b4 square, but knight b4 was not a very real threat. And now Magnus, bishop g4, increasing the pressure on the knight and potentially threatening knight d4 ideas as that knight on f3 is pinned to the queen on d1. Now here, Alexandra, all she has to do is h3. That would knock back the bishop or force a trade, which would be good for her. Instead, she goes queen to c1, stepping out of the pin and setting up bishop h6 ideas of her own. An interesting idea, but again, a little bit slow, a little bit passive. And here, Magnus Carlsen, he increases the pressure. Rook takes e1, flying in with the rook. The idea being he wants to trade one pair of rooks, then go rook to e8 and gain control of the e-file. So now Alexandra, knight takes e1, stepping out of the pin again, but then rook to e8 for Magnus Carlsen, and suddenly he has control over that open e-file. Now here, Alexandra, she has the chance to win that pawn on d5 outright. Knight takes d5 would be the best move, but instead she does not play that. Instead, f3 on the board, and this is a slightly dubious idea as it does weaken the dark squares around the king side, and it does block in that bishop on the g2 square. And now all of Alexandra's pieces, her bishop, her knight, they are just tripping over each other. This is not a good sign of things to come. All right, here Magnus, he plays bishop h3, the most aggressive move, trying to trade out that light squared bishop of Alexandra. But now bishop takes, queen takes, and knight to g2 for Alexandra, trying to reroute the knight to a better square, potentially eyeing e3 or f4 with the knight. f4 would be especially good as it does hit the queen on h3 with tempo. All right, Magnus Carlsen, what's he going to do? Well, he jumps in with the knight, knight to d4, a very strong idea, threatening that c2 pawn in the future if the queen moves away from the defense of the pawn. And here, Alexandra, instead of going, say, queen d1, try to increase the defense of the d-file, or the e-file, sorry, with the queen, while maintaining the defense of that c2 pawn, she actually goes queen to f1, giving up defense of that c2 pawn. And here, Magnus Carlsen, he just jumps in with the knight and gobbles up that pawn. Knight takes c2 on the board, hitting the rook. The rook has to move. Rook c1 on the board for Alexandra, and now knight d4 for Magnus Carlsen. Magnus Carlsen starting to slowly take over in this game despite only having 30 seconds on the clock and one less minor piece. Remember, Alexandra has 3 minor pieces versus the 2 of Magnus Carlsen. All right, now what's it going to be for Alexandra Botez? Rook to e1 on the board, trying to trade off a pair of rooks. Magnus Carlsen does oblige. Rook takes, then knight takes, and now queen to e6. Just centralizing the queen and applying pressure on the open e-file. Now Alexandra, knight g2, getting the knight out of harm's way. But here, Magnus Carlsen, he uses extra f-pawn as a battering ram in this position. So f5 on the board, potentially threatening f4 ideas in the future, and by far the strongest idea. Now Alexandra, knight to f4, jumping in with the knight and pressuring the d5 pawn. So very good move on her part. The double attack on that pawn and the queen on e6. But Magnus Carlsen, he's not slowing down. He slides the queen over to b6. Queen b6 on the board, the best move, and also pressuring the very weak b2 pawn. Now Alexandra, how is she going to defend the pawn? Well, it turns out she doesn't. The strongest move here is simply bishop c1, sliding the bishop back and defending. Bishop's not doing a whole lot on d2 anyway. But instead here, she jumps in with the knight. Knight c takes d5, winning the pawn and hitting the queen on b6. However, this does hang that pawn on b2. And here Magnus, he just slides in with the queen. Queen takes b2 on the board, pressuring the bishop, pressuring this pawn on a3. And Magnus again is starting to take over. All right, Alexandra, how is she going to defend? Well, she finds a strong move. Bishop c3, hitting both the queen on b2 and the knight on c3. And suddenly the bishop is relatively active on the long diagonal. So well done, Alexandra. But here Magnus, he's not slowing down. Knight takes f3, winning the pawn on the f3 square and opening up the attack of the bishop on c3. And beyond that, hitting the king with check. Therefore, queen takes f3 is virtually forced. All right, now Alexandra, queen takes, and then bishop takes c3 from Magnus, trading off those bishops. And here Alexandra trades one more pair of minor pieces. Knight takes and queen takes on the board. And suddenly we have an endgame where both sides have a queen. Alexandra has the extra knight, but Magnus Carlsen has a whole bunch of extra pawns in this position, 3 to be precise. So overall, material is level. However, Alexandra Botez does have those weak pawns on the queen side, and for that reason, Magnus here is playing for a win. Remember, he is short on time. He has to play fast. All right, here, Alexandra, knight d5 on the board, hitting the queen. Where is the queen going to go? Well, here, Magnus just gobbles up that free pawn on a3. Queen takes a3 on the board, and now Magnus is officially up material. All right, knight to e7 for Alexandra, trying to harass the black king. The black king moves, and then the knight moves back. Knight d5 on the board. Now queen b2. Magnus freeing up the path for the a-pawn to go flying down the board, but beyond that, he's laying a trap. And here, Alexandra Botez, she walks right into it. Queen to e3 on the board, and this was a fatal blunder for Alexandra. And here, this is a great time for a puzzle. If you'd like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the key idea for Magnus Carlsen as black in this position. And while you're at it, go and smash that YouTube like button. Thank you so much for doing that. All right, here, Magnus Carlsen, the key idea, of course. First of all, you give the check on the first rank to the king. So queen b1 check hits the king. Now the king is forced to the second rank. For example, you cannot go queen e1 or queen to c1. That loses the queen. So king g2, virtually forced. But now the key idea, queen to a2, forking both the knight on d5 and the king on the g2 square. And now that knight is going to fall. So king to h3, then queen takes d5. Magnus Carlsen showing no mercy for Alexandra Botez in this game. And now his plan is clear, pushing that a-pawn down the board as fast as he can. All right, Alexandra, queen to h6, gives the king a check. The king has to move. Then back to the e3 square, queen to e3. But here Magnus, he finds a brilliant way to force those queens off the board in a heartbeat. He goes f4, a temporary pawn sacrifice. The idea being, if you take with the queen, then queen to f5 hits the king and the queen, forcing the queens off. And instead, if you go g takes f4, as Alexandra did in the game, then the move is queen to e6, once again forking both the queen and the queens are forced off the board as the queen is hanging on e3. All right, now Alexandra, queen takes, f takes, and now she has to stop those pawns on the queen side. Can she get there in time? King to g3, a good move by Alexandra, stepping into the square of the pawn. But here Magnus Carlsen, the greatest endgame player of all time, he doesn't push his pawn 1 square, he pushes it 2 squares, and suddenly the king is outside the square of the pawn and cannot get there in time. So Alexandra tries her best. King to f2, a4, king to e2, a3. The pawn moves once again, and here Alexandra, instead of booking it towards the pawn, she runs away. King e3 on the board, now a1 queen, king to e4, and here the final move, queen to d4 check, and in this position, Alexandra Botez resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a game by Magnus versus Alexandra Botez, winning despite the enormous time deficit and the blunder on move 5 or 6 in this game. Alright, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash that like button and check out this video right here where Magnus Carlsen destroys Alexandra Botez in just 10 seconds. I am not exaggerating. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to love that one, so check it out. And I'll see you in the next video.